Sure, I need one.
Right, exactly.
You can't do one.
All right.
But
you.
if you're county, if you're county, 13 more years and you'll be able to have the one.
That's right. That's right.
So there'll be people sitting out here when you're talking to Catherine, okay? But trust me when I tell you, there were a lot more people watching you yesterday on TV. So you shouldn't be nervous because there's so many people that have already seen you that you shouldn't be nervous. So when Catherine asks you some questions, are you shivering because you're cold, or are you shivering because you're nervous? You're cold, okay. When Catherine asks you some questions, feel free to take as much time as you want to answer. So if she says, so tell me a little bit about, what it's been like, for you going to the doctors. And if you want to talk about last night's baseball game, talk about last night's. So don't be shy about talking. Because as Emily, not your mom Emily, the short, we'll call her short-haired Emily. Short-haired Emily said, you're the star of the show. People want to hear what you have to say. So you'll be out here with Catherine, okay? And then what we'll do is you'll talk to Catherine for 3, 4, 5 minutes. And then I'll come out and get you, and your mom will come out and she'll talk to Catherine for about 5 minutes or so. Okay? That work for you? All right. Do I need to talk to your agent before we do all of this to make sure it's okay with your agent?
Your handler, your manager.
Your manager, the one that, because you're a star. Stars have managers. And, they don't, stars don't make heavy decisions. They just have their manager.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning the program shortly. Please take your seats. Please welcome to the stage Atlantic Live President Margaret Lowe.
That's me. I'm Margaret Lowe. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Margaret Lowe. I'm president of Atlantic Live, and I'm so glad to see so many of you here for our forum, Children and Cancer. More than 10,000 cases of pediatric cancer are expected to be diagnosed this year, according to the National Cancer Institute. Leukemia and other cancers kill more children than any other disease, and thus the importance of our conversation here this morning. But new immunotherapy treatments and other innovative approaches mean the survival rate is climbing slowly. The fight for more money to treat these diseases go on, and new methods of data collection are helping researchers track how to help cancer patients later in life. We're going to talk about all of that this morning. We'll also get the view from Capitol Hill, and we'll hear one survivor's story. Before we get started, I do want to thank Aflac, our underwriter, for making this morning possible. We're so grateful to your support, Aflac. I hope everybody got a chance to meet Buddy and Sunny outside. It's not every day that you get to start your day getting your picture taken with a duck. So, and one additional not so serious note, please silence your cell phones, don't put them away. We're on Twitter at Atlantic Live, and we hope you'll join the conversation there using the hashtag #AtlanticCancer. We want you to be part of the conversation in the room too, so please be ready with questions throughout the morning so you can be part of the conversation here. On the stage, we'll set the stage for what the future holds for research. We're joined by Dr. Nina Seibel from the National Cancer Institute's Division of Cancer. Seibel co-chairs Pediatric Match, a new clinical trial led by the National Cancer Institute and the Children's Oncology Group. And here to lead the conversation is my colleague and the Atlantic's Washington editor-at-large, Steve Clemens.
Thank you, Margaret. Good morning. Nita, I always do a little bit of stage managing here. I'm gonna give you this chair. I'm gonna put this away so we can see each other. And
Sure.
Okay, Tom, stand up over here for a minute. Everybody, this is Tom. I just learned something. So as many of you know, and I didn't know, this is Child Cancer Awareness Month. He's wearing the gold ribbons It's impressive. I wish we all had them here. I feel badly I don't have mine, but we all do in spirit, okay? So thanks, Tom, for wearing it and reminding us this morning. So Nita, we're here in a way to focus on what to do about a pediatric cancer, what the new approaches are. I know you've been in this business for 25 years. I'm really interested in sort of time swaths and how things were 25 years ago and what you're looking at today when you see as in your role, and you're playing such a pivotal role with the National Cancer Institute with new therapies. What are the biggest leaps, strategic leaps you've seen in the 25 years you've been in this?
Oh, well, that's a great question, Steve. I mean,
She gave it to me before I came out here.
No, with pediatric oncology, it's sort of the example or set the stage for all of oncology, because early on in the late 1950s, with a tumor that occurred in kidney called Wilms tumor, they showed, pediatric oncologists working with radiation oncologists showed how you could use surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation to cure these children. That before, when they were diagnosed with a Wilms tumor, they were told that there was nothing they could do. At the same time, after that, with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, showed that the activity of certain drugs, to the point now with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, over 90% of children are cured of it. There are certain groups that have a much higher risk that we're still working on. But to really address your question, it's been very exciting to see all these changes. But at that time, particularly with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, we're using therapy for anyone who was diagnosed with this disease, with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. What we're doing now is that we're able to subtype the different types of cancers into different molecular types. And this enables us, with the new targeted agents, to be able to target those molecular defects.
So this is in the personalized.
Right. So
therapies,
this
right?
is where precision medicine comes to play in. So before, it was anyone who was diagnosed with this type of tumor, like medulloblastoma, was treated the same way. Now, with molecular tests to identify the certain subtypes of medulloblastoma, that's not the case. And that's where Pediatric Match is really helping us further identify, if we can identify in a child or adolescent's tumor a specific molecular defect and target it with a drug that is specific for that defect, will it make a difference?
So let's pause there just for a minute. Pediatric Match, which you just dropped in there, is a new platform. It's a new initiative of NCI. So why don't, for our audience, we have a lot of folks watching on camera, give us a quick treatment of Pediatric Match and what you're trying to do.
So Pediatric Match stands for Molecular Analysis for Treatment Choice. And what happens is that a child or adolescent between the ages of 1 to 21 who has their tumor, it comes back after being treated with standard therapy, or it responded initially and continued to grow, a piece of the tissue from the recurrent tumor is analyzed for genetic abnormalities. And in this study, not only do we identify the genetic abnormalities, but we also have, right now, we have 8 treatment arms that with different agents that will target different genetic abnormalities. So not only is it identified in this study, but also if the genetic abnormality has a drug that will target that, the patient is then eligible to be treated on this study. So this is really the first time where a study of this size in children and adolescents with recurrent tumors is being done, where they identify the genetic abnormality, and then they can get the drug as part of the study. In the past, or what has been happening, is that there are different centers throughout the country and even in Europe where they do the test to identify genetic abnormalities, but they don't have the drugs as part of it. So they recommend to the patient that they can be treated with a certain drug. Well, the problem with children and adolescents, so drugs, many of them are investigational, so they're not available. Here they are available in the the study itself. And actually, some of the drugs that are included in pediatric match haven't been tested in children before. They've been tested in adults, and we know what the safe dose in adults is for that specific drug. However, when we were designing pediatric match, we worked with experts from the FDA as well as from COG and the NCI, and it was agreed upon that if we knew how the drug worked in adults and we knew what kind of toxicities to expect, that we could incorporate it into pediatric match. So for some of the treatment arms, these drugs have never been used in children before, but we will monitor those children very closely, and we know what side effects to expect.
I've noticed in some of your commentary out there that you've given a lot of praise to some pharmaceutical companies that are partners in this.
Yes.
How does that work? Why is their partnership in this important? And I guess the second piece of it is, I'm sure the pharmaceutical industry is not a monolithic. What would you like to see more of in the private sector in making this work?
Well, Steve, I have to say, when we first started on this developing pediatric match, we had a list of different classes of drugs that we wanted to make sure to include based on knowing what abnormalities are in tumors in children and adolescents. And so I didn't know how the pharmaceutical company would respond. It's been so gratifying to see all of them have been very anxious to participate in pediatric match, and their participation means that they're involved with helping us identify the molecular variants that they think their drug will target, and then helping and then providing drug for the study. So it's been terrific to see the response. Now there's been a few that have said, no, we really don't want to put it in pediatrics yet, but by far, most of them, the majority, and particularly when we've gone after specific drugs have been very willing to work with us. And that's a unique feature of pediatric match because they're from different pharmaceutical companies, and to be able to include all these different drugs under a single study and to make them available is really the unique aspect or why we can do pediatric match.
I'm sure someone will challenge this out there when we get to comments and questions. You're welcome to. But as I've read it, it's a lot of the big gains in pediatric cancer research people credit to the National Cancer Institute. And if it was not for that, the economics of research, the economics of developing new therapies simply aren't there in the private sector. And that's one of the criticisms of the ecosystem of research and therapy and how to do that. And so you're, in a way, NCI, and what you're doing is fixing a market failure in the research and development side. And I'd be interested in sort of hear from your perspective inside whether you see it the same way, whether you think the marketplace can, in fact, reform itself in any way to kind of focus on children as well as the kind of broader cancer spectrum?
Well, that's a really interesting question. It has a couple different aspects to it. First of all, fortunately, pediatric cancer is not as common as cancers that occur in adults. So the National Cancer Institute, supports numerous studies that are done in pediatrics, but they also support the Children's Oncology Group. And you're absolutely correct in that we wouldn't be where we are right now with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, with Wilms tumor, with neuroblastoma, if the Children's Oncology Group hadn't done controlled trials, randomized trials, and where we had well-defined endpoints and found out what works and what doesn't work. On the other side of your question, so, we have small numbers. Individual institutions can't do those types of studies. You have to work together in a group. So that's great, and that's been going, that's an example for all of medical oncology. We wish that adults participated in clinical trials like we see in pediatrics. But the other issue is the pharmaceutical industry in that, you're right, they don't make the drugs for the pediatric tumors because the market isn't there. So that's where, when you mention reform or, increasing awareness or engaging the pharmaceutical companies to make this a higher priority is so important.
when you are out there, I have there's a nice little brochure you can all download from the internet on this pediatric match trial. I'm a pretty layperson in this field. It says about 200 to 300 pediatric patients are expected to be screened each year. To me, this sounds small, but am I wrong? Is this large? Is this a small number? And how, as you develop and kind of see where this goes in these kind of 8 arms of work and research, how does that then come in and basically spread through the treatment system in the United States?
So that's a good question. 200 to 300 may seem small, but you have
Because
to...
there are about 10,000 a year, right? 10,000
Right,
child
right. But
cancers.
these are patients whose tumors haven't responded to standard therapy that have come back. These are only solid tumors. They're solid tumors that includes, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It
Right.
includes histiocytoses.
So this
And-
is a much larger share of
well,
that. Yeah.
you have to remember, it doesn't include the leukemias. And acute lymphoblastic leukemia is the most common malignancy that we see in children. So the leukemias aren't included in pediatric match. And so there are certain groups of patients, like Wilms tumor patients, who have a very good outcome. We don't expect many of those patients to be enrolled. So 200 to 300, it really reflects the tumors that have come back, and
Right.
particularly within the solid tumor.
I see. And so then as you find, I suppose, find good stories in the precision medicine arena on this, how do you then take that and basically transmit
Sure.
that knowledge broadly? Because one of the things, just frankly, it comes up in a lot of the cancer and health forums we do, is the unlevelness in literacy, particularly among practitioners in the country. So how do you move from the excellent work you're doing and kind of deal with some of the literacy unevenness in the country when it comes to dealing with people in Kansas and Oklahoma, these big gaps that you sometimes find in people's access to sort of smart therapies that they can have access to and that
Sure.
they can afford?
Sure. So pediatric match is intended to be a screening study. So our plan is that 20 patients are enrolled on each treatment arm. If we see a response, and the response is defined as shrinkage in the tumor or stabilization would also be a reason that a patient could continue on the drug. If we see that in 3 out of the 20 patients, that's of interest to us. And so if that happens, then we will expand the patient population for that specific group. And if we see it, particularly in one type of histology, one type of cancer, we'll expand it in that type of cancer. But it will also give us an idea of where we can further test this agent. So if we see it in a certain type of cancer, but patients are on it for several months, they have a good response, and then the tumor starts to grow, well then perhaps it needs to be combined with another agent, either a chemotherapeutic agent or another targeted agent. So our plan is, if we see evidence of activity, then we plan to design additional studies to further, see how we can incorporate this into therapy. And ideally, we'd like to incorporate it up front when a patient is diagnosed, not just in the recurrent setting.
In a little bit, I'm going to be talking with Congressman Brian Higgins, who's been one of the co-chairs of the Cancer Caucus in the Congress. He's a big champion of immunotherapy, and I've been interested in your reticence, if I can call it that, or your caution about immunotherapy in some of your comments. That immunotherapy is coming up everywhere, sort of the new wonder approach, and you're saying, there's some not so wonderful parts of that. Can you share with us what you're trying to put on the table?
Well, immunotherapy, don't get me wrong, Steve. I think immunotherapy is great.
It's my job to thrive in darkness and cynicism.
And it's a very exciting area. The issue with immunotherapy, which is a little disappointing from the pediatric oncologist standpoint, is that we just haven't seen the same responses in children and adolescents where it's been tested as they've seen in adults. So I think it's just challenging to us because we want to find out how can we use immunotherapy. In some of the initial, with CAR T cells in ALL, that's been shown how that's made a big difference in the relapse setting for ALL. With dinutuximab, which is a chimeric antibody with neuroblastoma, that's been shown. But those are really the successes in pediatric oncology. So the challenge now is to see what do we need to do, or how do we need to combine it so it will be active in children and adolescents. Fortunately, because of the moonshot, there's actually money that's been allocated to study this more in the Pediatric Immunotherapy Discovery and Development Network, in which we're asking investigators to submit plans on how they can investigate this more. How can they identify immunotherapeutic targets in pediatric cancers? What are the agents that can be used for immunotherapy? And why is it that a tumor may respond initially and then all of a sudden evades the immune system? So those are all areas that we need, that are different from what's been going on in adults, that we really need more information so we can use immunotherapy.
I want to go to the audience here in just a minute, but one other question, glad you mentioned the moonshot. I'd love to know whether you're finding that effort of the Cancer Moonshot, Vice President Biden's work, useful or having any impact at all. It would be interesting. And what I'd really like to know also, just in this, I met this woman, I don't know where she's at, Beth. Beth worked with Dr. Seibel. Are you out there, Beth? There you are. We were in the elevator for like 30 seconds together. And I said, who are you? And she says, I'm a nurse practitioner, but I work with Nita Seibel at some point. And you could just sort of tell she was really into this subject. And I'm interested in the human side. I mean, oftentimes when we're talking about science and therapies and 8 arms and pediatric match, I'm just interested in how you kind of keep grounded at the human level and remember that you're dealing with kids. I know that may be an unfair question, but I think it's important.
It is important. Personally, it's because of my strong faith and balancing that. That's essential. But, I decided to go into pediatric oncology versus medical oncology because the cancers that we see in children and adolescents are different than the ones you see in adults for the most part. And even though it's terrible when a child dies because of their cancer, in pediatric oncology, there are many more that survive or are cured of it. But, just the whole journey that a family goes through, it's a privilege to get to, stand right with the family, the patient, and everyone, your whole medical staff, such as your nurse practitioners, such as Beth, to help take the family and the patient through this journey. And it's very gratifying now when I get notes about college graduations or getting married, and to see some of these children, knowing what they went through when they were diagnosed, and now seeing them going on with their life. But that also brings up the whole issue of survivorship, because that's really essential too, because our treatment, we have to keep that in mind. Not only do we want to cure them of their cancer, but also to make sure that they can have the highest quality of life.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Thumbs up on Moonshot, thumbs down?
Oh, yeah,
okay,
thumbs up, definitely.
Let me take any quick comments, questions from you. Yes, right over here.
My name is Susan Finston. Oh, sorry. Hi. My name is Susan Finston. I am a co-founder with biotech pioneer Nanda Chakrabarty of a microbiome company with lead oncology peptides. It's not on.
It's not on.
Let me see if I can get another mic.
I guess we're bringing you a new mic.
Thank you. Okay, this is better. All right, so Amrita Therapeutics has late preclinical stage microbiome oncology peptides, and we're focusing on the SMAR1 biomarker, which is a master cell regulator, and is associated with so many cancers, where particularly for adult women, breast cancer, late stage is associated with total degeneration and disappearance of SMAR1. So my question is, it's so wonderful to hear about how you're working with the larger established companies. What's the role for an emerging microbiome company like Amrita that has a strong focus on the SMAR1 biomarker, which we believe can really hold less immunogenicity, less toxicity than the immuno-oncology options?
Thank you.
Susan, that's a good question. You know, we're not limited to the larger pharmaceutical companies. Many of the drugs, several of the drugs are from very small companies that we work with. So our criteria for investigating agents that we could bring into pediatric match is really we need a biomarker so we can identify those patients who would benefit from the drug. And so that's where our conversations usually start. And we are open and willing to talk to companies to see, you know, if they think their agent would be applicable to pediatric
So it's driven
match.
by the biomarker and the agent, not the
Yes,
size of
right.
the firm. Is
Oh,
what I'm
no,
hearing you
not at
say,
all.
yeah.
Right.
Interesting. So that's
Right.
not one last question here. Yes. Hi. Good morning.
Hi, I'm Jan Hamilton from Aspen, Colorado. Steve, I gave you a ride to the Ideas Festival about
That's
5
right.
years ago in my white.
I remember, Dan. Good to see you.
Good to see you
She
again.
did. She picked me up. It was, you know, and I
Well,
was
this
late.
vagabond just
You
walking
see?
along the street of Aspen.
Yeah.
You were in front of the Pepke House, as I remember.
Right.
Okay, good to see you again. Now, I have a PhD in human nutrition from LSU with a postdoc at Georgetown. My work is in cancer aftercare because I cannot treat, diagnose, or prescribe. I'm working with Dr. John Mendelsohn and Barak Agarwal from India on nutritional markers
Right.
in after the chemo, radiation, and surgery. What can we do with these children to keep the cancer from coming back?
Thank you. So it's kind of a survivorship and
let me
what
just-
patterns was going to be an ongoing part of the conversation here today. But do you have quick thoughts on
Well,
that element?
actually, through the Childhood Cancer Survivor Study, they have collected DNA on all these patients, and they are now analyzing them at a molecular level to see if there are certain genetic characteristics that suggest that certain patients should have, for example, not undergo radiation or are more likely to develop a second malignancy. I think they can also apply that to nutritional areas as well. So we'll see what type of data we get back to see what the molecular, you know, if we can identify certain patients that would benefit from a certain nutritional supplementation after therapy. But this is an area, you know, that is very new for pediatric oncology. So we'll just have to see what the data really show.
Nita, thank you for. We got to, unfortunately, Joe, we got to finish. Yeah. Thank you very much, Ann. Nita Seibel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank you.
thank you.
Oh, thanks, Steve.
Next, a view from Capitol Hill. Joining Steve Clemons, please welcome to the stage New York Congressman Brian Higgins, who co-chairs the House Cancer Caucus.
How are you?
Great, good. How are you? Good to see you. Thank you for having me.
This is the Steve Clemons Show, a new product of the Atlantic media empire.
Wow.
Great to be with you. Great suit.
Thank you.
Let's talk cancer. You're co-chair of the House Cancer Caucus. What's happening?
We are trying to find a way for the cancer community to communicate more effectively to Congress, because Congress plays such an important role, and we failed badly in our responsibility over the last 20 years. In the 1990s, you know, there were record numbers of levels of cancer research money. About 30% of all grant applications to the National Institutes of Health, National Cancer Institute were funded. That was reduced in the 2000s to about 8%. So not only do you lose...
how much?
8%. So not only do you lose important research, you lose rock star researchers who decide to leave the field because, there's not a lot of work for them. So, the hard thing about cancer research is this, and this is why we have to find a more effective way to communicate to Congress. The economics of cancer research are awful. They just are. Innovation is trial and error. There's going to be more losses than there are wins. When you win big. So cancer research has to be sustained over a long period of time. A lot of promising new therapies have been in phases of discovery for 2 and 3 decades. But if it's delayed because of lack of funding, then those potential treatments are delayed for people that need them. So we just need to find a much more effective way to communicate. I remember when I was first elected in 2005, the American Cancer Society had a program called the 2015 campaign, the objective of which was to eliminate all death and suffering due to cancer by the year 2015. Obviously, it fell short. But what's most important is you're making progress toward the goal. The whole, all their advocates converged on Washington, and that night, Congress passed a resolution supporting the 2015 campaign and its goals. It passed unanimously. 2 months later, they cut funding to cancer research. So to me, that said that more work needs to be done to more effectively communicate to Congress.
Such an interesting and unexpected beginning to a conversation. I think it's very profound what you just shared, because we've got a lot of the folks engaged in the cancer. What would you advise, given where things are now? Because one I wondered is cancer and the prevalence. It is the 900-pound gorilla out there. It's so pervasive. Is there a jadedness in Congress that can be overcome by better communication? What would you advise folks here to do to fill this deficit that you've just called out?
I think it's already been done. Keep in mind that 2 weeks ago, the Senate Appropriations Committee, in a bipartisan bill, increased funding to the National Institutes of Health by $2 billion to about $36 billion. That's a 20% increase over the last 3 years. My example that I cited in 2005, that never would have happened. And I think it's attributed to the effectiveness of the cancer community, who are not only having docs and nurses communicate with members of Congress, but the afflicted and those who love the afflicted. And there's no better advocate sitting in a congressman's office than somebody that tells you their story, because the story is all the same, and prevention's important, early detection's important. People don't realize, but less than 10% of cancer deaths are attributed to the original tumor. That's why early detection's important. It's when cancer spreads, when it moves, when it advances, when it metastasizes to a vital organ that you need, that cancer becomes lethal. So that underscores the importance of early detection. Lifestyles, stay out of the sun, nutrition, smoking, 30% of all cancer deaths could be eliminated if you eliminate tobacco use. 1 in 2 men will develop cancer in their lifetimes, invasive cancer, 1 in 3 women. The prevalence is more for men because they smoke more. So there's some pretty commonsensical things that can be communicated where money can be invested toward the goal of reducing the incidences of cancer.
What is your caucus doing with regards to pediatric cancer in children?
It's a tough issue. As you know, only about 4% of federal funding, research dollars, go to pediatric cancer because it's so rare. You'll have about, 11,000, 12,000 new cases this year. Some 1,300 kids will die from pediatric cancer. But good progress has been made. The United States Food and Drug Administration just approved a gene-based therapy for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which is leukemia that afflicts 25% of all those kids that have cancer. And cancer is the leading disease-based cause of death for kids from 0 to 14. So good progress has been made, and it's an amazing thing. 40 years ago, you had three options. You know, you could cut out cancer, literally, by surgery. You could burn it out through radiation, or you could destroy it through highly toxic chemicals called chemotherapy. Now there's amazing breakthroughs in immunotherapy that you know, remove the body's, you know, from your immune system T cells, genetically engineer them, reintroduce them to the body, and those cells can now not only identify but kill cancer cells. And these kids that went through these clinical trials to test both the safety and efficacy of these treatments, it's a drug developed by Novartis, they're showing, they're in remission like 83%. The cancer community is very, very excited about the very promising results, not only from the clinical trials, but the FDA approved this unanimously. I think just showing, you know, the great potential of this new drug for kids really for whom traditional therapies had failed.
I was just reading about the Roswell Park Cancer Institute, which I guess is in your district.
It is.
And I was unaware of what a leading role they're playing in immunotherapy approaches on cancer. I guess my question in that, and I know it's received funding, and I know that the funding picture is so important broadly, but there's a broad ecosystem, and you referred to it about, you know, rock star researchers and losing them. What's the health of that ecosystem broadly around someplace like the Roswell Center, and should we be worried about it?
Well, Roswell Park Cancer Institute was the first comprehensive cancer center in America. Chemotherapy was developed there, photodynamic therapy was developed there, critical studies linking, I mentioned before, tobacco use in cancer, and you know, the blockbuster drugs for metastatic breast cancer, Herceptin, trastuzumab is the chemical name, was clinically trialed and tested at Roswell. And Roswell currently has clinical trials that are very promising in immunotherapy. So not only is this gene-based therapy showing great promise for pediatric cancer, for many adult cancers as well. And we're you know, the interesting thing is we're not really looking at where cancer is. It's where its origins are from. So these therapies deal with several different cancers where, you know, 20, 30 years ago, you know, you were dealing with breast cancer, you're dealing with one drug for breast cancer. But, you know, we're learning a lot more about cancer. I always say, and you know, people say, well, you know, you be careful about this. Nobody's ever died from breast cancer. What people die from is when breast cancer, you know, moves to an organ, the brain or the liver, and cancer cells are fast-growing cells, and when they pervade the liver or the brain or some other organ you need to live, they crowd out the healthy cells, and that organ is deemed dead, and you can't, so are you, because you can't survive.
You know, this may be an unfair way to frame it, but I remember when I worked in the Senate in the 1990s for Jeff Bingaman, at that time, Dianne Feinstein was pushing a breast cancer stamp. And it was a stamp that you could go get a postage stamp, and it would kick money into, you know, funds for research. And you know, and I thought a lot about this. It was a big issue for us because it raised the question about what about other ailments out there that didn't have a stamp? Was there a zero-sum battle between different cancer therapies? One of the things I've been concerned about in today's forum is you sort of wonder, since we have, you know, Child Cancer Awareness Month, whether or not this is sort of the under-approached, under-tended part of the cancer thing. And I'm just, you're so literate in this area. Is it wrong of someone like me on the outside to think that there are these tensions inside the cancer research area that are unhealthy and that need to be fixed? Is there, you know, are there sways in the cancer research attention of the political and the research base that are kind of off where they should be? Or do you have confidence that the entire picture is sort of being fairly processed through, if that makes any sense?
It does. Look, there's always going to be tension in the research community as to, you know, should Alzheimer's be the priority? Should cancer be the priority? Should it be adult cancer? Should it be pediatric cancer? Those problems always exist. But so I don't know. Here's what I do know. Here's what I do know. That investments to the National Institutes of Health, the National Institutes of Health it's the largest research institution in the world. When we invest big money in NIH and the National Cancer Institute, a subdivision of NIH, we invest in jobs in our communities. You mentioned the clinical trials that are occurring in immunotherapy at Roswell Park Cancer Institute. That's creating jobs, good jobs that are bringing people from all over the world to Buffalo. And the great renaissance that's occurring in downtown Buffalo is really a result of the growth of a place called the Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus, which is 9 anchor institutions and 150 companies. The original institution is Roswell Park Cancer Institute. And people want to live near where they work. So there's a residential renaissance occurring in downtown Buffalo. So residential demand, commercial demand, economic growth as a direct result of research dollars. But the other issue is, and I think people understand this, if America doesn't lead in cancer research, there's no leadership in the world. That's what we do. When you look at the things that grow the American economy, it's infrastructure investment, it's educating your people to and beyond the current technology, and it's scientific research. You have a smartphone, and every technology in your smartphone, touchscreen technology, global positioning satellite system, Siri, the ever-pleasant voice-activated personal assistant. It came from research from the federal government. Steve Jobs in Apple, his genius wasn't technology. His genius was design and marketing. The problem is all of our tax dollars paid for that innovation and technology, and all the smartphones are made in China. So we should be smarter about this. The American economy is the greatest public-private partnership in the history of the world. And scientific research is a big, big part of that.
Do you have, I'm trying to think right now, if there was a Republican you, a version of you that I could have such a literate discussion about cancer and what we needed to do. And do you have a partner on the Republican side that you think could do as well as you have done in this discussion?
Well, I appreciate that, but yes, absolutely.
Who are some of your partners?
Leonard Lance is a fellow that on the Republican side who is very articulate and very passionate about these issues. There are a number of members. And the interesting thing is they typically will come from a district that has a comprehensive cancer center in their district. So they not naturally, but over time, they develop.
They get tooled up.
They get tooled up. Very well said.
Well, the other side of it, though, is the cost side. I interviewed even on this stage Peter Welch. So your colleague Peter has been engaged. Both he's pro-research, but he's also concerned on cost. I know you've also been trying to address some of the cost issues and treatment parity issues. What do you think is missing as we talk about research development? We don't often talk about, it's sort of a detached discussion from accessibility for the average person out there who's got to work their way through, cost hurdles that are sometimes pretty dramatic.
Recognizing the reality, as I said, the economics of cancer research suck. They just do. But if you look at private businesses, spend a lot of money on innovation, and that is by definition trial and error. There is a lot of waste toward getting to the place you ultimately want to be. And the only failure in cancer research is when you quit or you're forced to quit because of lack of funding. We can certainly get better at it. It can certainly become more efficient, but innovation by definition is inefficient. And to hold researchers to a standard that's unrealistic. As I mentioned, all of these drugs, Herceptin I mentioned before, Gleevec, another one for chronic myelogenous leukemia. All of these drugs were in what's referred to as the pipeline for 20, 30 years. And that's what clinical trials are all about. You test the safety and efficacy of a proposed treatment. And when it doesn't meet the standard that you would hope for and that everybody hopes for, you just got to get back in the lab and just keep working it. So it's to recognize that you can't say, well, over the last 10 years, Congress, we gave the National Institutes of Health and National Cancer Institute a lot of money. We're going to pull back a little bit. That is self-defeating because cancer research has to be sustained over a long period of time. I think both Republicans and Democrats have learned that. And that's as evidenced by the fact that the administration wanted money diverted from really scientific research to border security. And it's just what happened. In Congress, both Republicans and Democrats in the Senate appropriations process said no. Scientific research, cancer research is too important. And they increased by $2 billion 3 weeks ago in the Senate appropriations bill. And that's what we should strive for, to change minds and not appeal to one party or the other, but to all of us as Americans.
I want to go to the audience, but Francis Collins, director of the NIH, have had the privilege of interviewing him a few times. He says exactly what you do about funding and research. It's pretty much identical. I was surprised. Were you surprised when President Trump kept them in place? And is that a good thing?
I think it's a good thing. Dr. Collins has been around, not only with NIH, but NCI. And these folks are passionate about what they do. They have street cred, or lab cred, if you will. And I think that they're in a great position to speak to Congress with great authority.
Were you surprised when the president kept him?
Nope.
Interesting. Let me open up the floor. Yes, right here in the back. We have a microphone going to you. Good morning.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Dawn Lee Carty from Speak Life. I have a 9-year-old daughter who suffers
And
from...
just so that folks know in the back, because we have a lot of folks, that mic is not working again.
Oh.
So I apologize. Got to worry about our video watchers. Here we go.
Good morning. My name is
That mic's
Dawn.
not working
No.
Sorry, apologies.
Will
it's
my
on.
voice
All right.
project?
Okay,
Okay,
there
there
we
we
go.
go. Good morning. My name is Dawn Lee Carty, founder of Speak Life. I have a 9-year-old daughter who suffers from frontal lobe epilepsy. She was born diagnosed 6 months into her life. She's been introduced to several opiates for over the years, and the only thing that I found was that my daughter just went deeper and deeper. The seizures never ceased. She would suffer up to 60 seizures a day. 2 years ago, I took a trip out to Colorado and introduced her to CBD oil, and my daughter that went from having 60 seizures a day is now 92% seizure-free. So with that, she's inspired Speak Life, where we are doing a documentary and we're going around and we're speaking life and getting testimonies from cancer patients, epilepsy parents, Crohn's disease. And what I've been finding on our road trip is a lot of people that do suffer from cancer and a lot of people that are finding relief with medicinal cannabis. Was wondering, what is your point of view about it? Also being interrupted with Jeffrey Sessions perhaps wanting to enforce legal action on medicinal cannabis patients. What are your thoughts about medicinal cannabis therapy, and have you seen results?
Thank you.
Well, the states are taking the lead in that. If there is, like anything else, you test something for both safety and efficacy. And if marijuana use for medicinal purposes is effective, that's a decision that should be made by a doctor and their patient.
Other questions, comments? If you were to, let me just wrap this up, if you were to try and adjust something in the next session or two that you feel, it sounds like you're optimistic about funding. I'm sort of interested in what you're not optimistic about, that you think is the boulder that needs to be rolled up the hill, that we in these forums, we as journalists, need to pay more attention to that we're not. What would you give us counsel to do?
Look, I'm a I'm a student of government as much as I am a practitioner. I taught history and economics at the college level. I think the debate is in the wrong place. It's about spending, it's about debt and deficit. Debt and deficit is very important, but there's one way to grow yourself out of debt and deficit. It's to grow the economy. There's only one way to do that, invest in your economy. And when you invest in infrastructure, education, scientific research, stop whining about China. They cheat on their currency. Their human rights, their environmental and labor records are atrocious. But stand up and compete with them, because China is doing what America's not doing. They just invested $1 trillion in infrastructure, a lot of money in scientific research, and we're screwing around with the wall. You know, they're opening up, we're closing down. America, as I mentioned previously, is the greatest economy in the history of the world. But the world's very different now. It's web-enabled, it's globalized, it's based on innovation and new technology. It's to begin to change the debate, get away from right and left, and give people the human capital, the tools that they need to succeed. That is a good and just society, and that's the great tradition of America. And don't accept people that say, you know, we got to cut spending here, we got to cut spending. Yeah, look, you got a $4 trillion budget. There's a lot of waste in there. You can't defend the efficiency of a $4 trillion budget. That's what the political process is all about. It's a fair debate to be discussing the extent to which government should be involved and not involved. That's fair. It should be rigorous. It should be fact-based. But I think, you know, starting to focus in on growth of the American economy, which will solve a lot of problems. And, you know, keep in mind here, you know, we've been talking about debt and deficit for a long time, but our economic growth is anemic. It's been below 2% for the past 20 years. China has economic growth of almost 7%, and that's low compared to other years. So I just think that when you look at, like, the 1990s, for example, we had 4% economic growth over an 8-year period, each year over an 8-year period, right? We created 22 million private sector jobs, right? We didn't have a budget deficit. We had a budget surplus of over $260 billion. Guess what else we did during that same period of time? We doubled the amount of funding to the National Institutes of Health and the National Cancer Institute. And that's when all the rock star researchers were working. So just be smart about your own future and the future that we are all here and entrusted to for the next generation. And I think Washington gets too stuck in the moment. You know, it's all about the 24-hour news cycle. It's all about the persistent presidential campaign. And it's all about, you know, mucking up the other guy in the short term. But a lot's lost over the longer term. And let's be big game hunters, but let's be long ball hitters. And let's recognize that what we do today should have a lasting and sustained positive influence moving forward for the longer term.
Such an interesting macro frame. Thank you very much for it. I know we're going to want you back. I hope you want to come back.
Sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Brian Higgins, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And now, a look at how breakthroughs in immunotherapy treatments are providing hope for pediatric cancer patients. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Timothy Kripe, Division Chief of Hematology, Oncology, and Bone Marrow Transplantation at Nationwide Children's Hospital. Nancy Goodman is the founder and executive director of Kids v. Cancer. And Tom Whitehead is the co-founder of the Emily Whitehead Foundation, named after his daughter. Here to lead the discussion, please welcome The Atlantic's Olga Kazan.
Okay, so we're going to now talk about a field of cancer treatment called immunotherapy. So we often, when we talk about cancer treatment, you hear about radiation, you hear about chemotherapy. This is really a new kind of field that is just sort of beginning to be used in pediatric cancer patients. So I'm here with Tom Whitehead, Nancy Goodman, and Timothy Kripe to kind of really dig into this field. And Tom, why don't we start with you, because you really have a personal connection to this as being the father of someone who's one of the first people, or the first child, being treated with immunotherapy for cancer. Can you tell us Emily's story and a little bit about how she got enrolled in the trial and kind of how that process was for her?
Yeah, so Emily was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia just after her 5th birthday. And, you know, we were told at the time that it was the most curable kind of cancer. And if you had to have a kid with cancer, that's the one you wanted to have. And we got started, and she had a rough start, but she did get into remission. And she stayed that way for the first 16 months. And then while still in treatment, she relapsed. And at that point, the protocol was to go to a bone marrow transplant. We tried to do that, and she relapsed again before her donor would come and donate the cells. So at that point, we were kind of out of options. And we transferred from our local hospital down to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And the trial had just opened, so we entered her into the CAR T-cell trial. And we took her cells out after we enrolled her. She stayed in isolation in her room for 6 weeks while they took them off to the lab, and they told her they were going to take them to boot camp and turn them into an army that would come back and fight her cancer. So they gave her cells back in April of 2012, and after she got her cells, reintroduced to her system, she got very sick, and she ended up in a coma and put on a ventilator, and she stayed that way for 14 days. And then she finally woke up on her 7th birthday when she came back to us, and that was on May 2nd of 2012. And then 8 days later, they checked her bone marrow, and she is cancer-free.
Wow.
And she remains that way 5 years later.
Wow.
Yeah, very blessed.
And how old is she now?
So she's 12, and she just started in 7th grade.
Wow.
And when you see her with her friends, you can't tell anything ever happened to her.
Oh my gosh. And she was 7 when all of this happened?
She actually, she was treated and she was still 6, and then she woke up on her 7th birthday.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And you told me a really interesting story about how you actually found out about this trial or this type of treatment, because it wasn't something that was presented to you by your doctors, right?
No. So my wife did some research, and when she first relapsed, we realized that things aren't going normal, and we decided to go for that second opinion at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. But my wife used her research skills to look into the T-cell trial, because we had seen in the news that Dr. June at Penn had treated 3 adults with CLL, with a different type of leukemia. So when we went down for a second opinion about bone marrow transplant, at one point we went back down for another opinion, and they had mentioned it, but we had time where my wife could look into it and research it where we felt comfortable. But we were told that it wasn't going to be ready in time for her. So we didn't know that she would, when they finally told us back at the Hershey Medical Center where we were treating that they just didn't have any more weapons to fight her cancer. And they suggested to give her one more round of chemotherapy and take her home in hospice. We paged Dr. Susan Reingold at CHOP. And she actually said, "This is amazing that you paged me today, because the last email I read yesterday was the FDA approval to enter our first child into the T-cell trial."
Wow. So I wanted to dig into why this treatment is so interesting and so different from what has been used to treat cancer in the past. So there's a study recently that found that 70% of the survivors of childhood cancers have a mild or moderate chronic condition. So maybe Dr. Kripe, you can kind of weigh in on why that typically is. Why do these health issues linger? And how is immunotherapy different from some of the more traditional treatments that are used?
Well, the more traditional treatments are very much like a sledgehammer. They don't have very much precision, and they're genotoxic, usually, meaning they damage DNA. So, that's the blueprint of all cells. So they can cause secondary cancers, they can cause damage to tissues. This new therapy, the CAR T therapy, is what they call a living drug. It's an immune therapy, meaning we're harnessing T cells and what they do normally to fight infections, but to turn them around and fight a cancer. So they're not genotoxic, they're not damaging the tissues. They're more precise in terms of only targeting the cancer molecules that have been engineered to do so. So in that way, they're much less, we think, have much fewer toxicities long term. Obviously, the risk of having this kind of treatment, as Emily experienced with, was this so-called cytokine release syndrome, because when you get the immune system so revved up, then it kind of caused collateral damage to her system. But they figured out very quickly how to counteract that. And we don't think there's going to be long-term side effects, but it's too early to know.
And can you kind of just clarify how it works exactly for people who aren't familiar with the sort of inner workings of the body and how the immunotherapy actually works?
Well, so when we talk about immunotherapy, we talk about a lot of different kinds of things. So immunotherapy for neuroblastoma at the moment is using an antibody that targets the tumor. Immunotherapy with CAR T cells is taking one's T cells, which are the normal infection-fighting cells, out and basically redirecting them. So it's also an interesting therapy and a new therapy because it's a gene therapy. They take genes, put them into the cells, grow them up in the lab, put them back in the patient. The gene that they put in is a receptor on the surface of the cell that goes after the tumor. So people are trying to engineer these not just against leukemia, but against solid tumors as well. There's probably other challenges that come into play there because solid tumors are different than leukemia. They have a microenvironment that resists immune therapies, but there's a lot of different kinds of therapies. There's vaccines, there's virus therapies, one that has been approved where we inject a live virus into tumors. So there's a whole plethora, a whole platform of different kinds of immunotherapies under development. So it is very exciting times.
Wow. And Nancy, maybe you can walk us through kind of the journey of how we got to this point with using this treatment in children, actually, and whether, has that been kind of a harder road than maybe treatments for adults?
Sure. So I think the most exciting thing about Emily's story is that she got the drug. And historically, what we've seen, as many of us in the audience know, is that one of the greatest impediments to researchers researching childhood cancers is just getting access to the drugs to study in the first place. And what happened here, which was really exciting, is that Dr. Carl June, who was the scientist developing the CAR T-cell therapy, was a close collaborator with Dr. Steve Grupp, who was a pediatric oncologist. And because of their relationship and their personalities and the quality of their science, they decided to do a pediatric trial very early, and they were able to do it. But that's an anomalous situation. And I think what we see here is it's doable. Even when you have a very novel therapy, you can put it in kids very, very early. We have to remember these kids are, they have no other options. They're very close to hospice, that's their next step. And the result is, Emily's here and she's a healthy, beautiful little girl, and other children are as well. And I hope that as we look at all of these other new exciting immunotherapies, including some, Tim is developing, that we have an opportunity to stick kids on them as early as possible, as early as what is scientifically and medically the right time to do it.
And has the hesitancy there been just that they're so young, maybe they can't handle it, or what has been the reluctance?
It's funny that you ask that because kids tend to tolerate chemotherapies much better than adults. Adults have a lot of other diseases, comorbidities, as we say, other challenges. And so in general, we can go to higher doses, we can be more aggressive with kids than we can with adults. It's not a very well-known fact. So pediatric oncologists tend to be much more aggressive with their treatments than adult oncologists.
Yeah. And just as a sort of personal way to think about this, so my son died of cancer. Jacob died almost 8 years ago. And when he was really in the end stages of cancer, I looked at 8 different therapies that were in development for adult cancers. And none of these therapies were available for children at the time. And there was some early preclinical evidence that they should be studied in children. Maybe they wouldn't have helped Jacob. But the fact is, just a few of these drugs now, just like in the last year, pediatric trials have opened. That's 7 years of kids who haven't had a shot at these drugs that were considered worthy of study in adult cancers. And so, why are we leaving our kids behind like this?
The other frustration with that is if the drug fails an adult trial, the company may kill the drug. And so then it's not available, even if it might work for a pediatric
Yeah.
type of tumor. So we're losing out in that way too.
And go ahead.
I was just going to say, 95% of all drugs are abandoned between phase one, and the approval process.
Well, and I wanted to talk about the cost. There was an article recently that the drug Kymriah cost something like $500,000. And of course, that's the cost before your insurance kicks in and whatever might be available to you. Can you talk about your experience with getting this treatment paid for, what you had to go through, and kind of, maybe others can weigh in on what is sort of the bigger picture, the hurdles to families getting this drug that is really quite expensive?
Well, I'll start off by saying, at that time, I told him, if you can save our daughter, you can have whatever we have. There's no price you put on your child. But we were very fortunate that we lived within Pennsylvania, and Emily was treated in Philadelphia, so there was some state grant money. And being in an experimental trial, a lot of those costs were absorbed by the grant money that they had. But it still was very expensive. And we were very fortunate that a lot of people supported us and did fundraisers for us. And I tell people now, during that time, I just felt, a strong sense to ask for prayers for Emily, and that's all we ever asked for. And if you didn't pray, send your positive thoughts. And that turned into fundraisers and that kept us afloat during that time. So we always had enough money to eat and take care of the bills that weren't paid. So we were very fortunate. But again, I think looking back, when they told us she needed a bone marrow transplant, we were told, that the cost of the transplant is covered under your insurance, but the search to find a donor is around $150,000, and that's not covered.
Wow.
So I think from what I know about it is it's about the same cost as what a bone marrow transplant would be, and for the children that have been able to get in the trial, it's been more effective.
I mean, if you think about the cost, it's a one-time treatment.
Right.
So a lot of drugs that are very expensive are given routinely, weekly, monthly.
Right.
So this is a one-time treatment, and what's been set up now, which is a very attractive model, I think, is that the patients don't get charged unless it works.
Okay.
So that's kind of a new twist on drug development. So that's very interesting.
Jacob's medical costs were $2 million.
Yeah. Is there, kind of just alongside this cost issue, but just other regulatory hurdles, what has the U.S. government already done to facilitate these therapies being available to children? And what else needs to be done in order to help more parents like you?
One of the challenges we don't know about in terms of the science, which of the immunotherapies in adults are going to work in kids. So I think immunotherapy, as I mentioned, is a lot of different things. I think of them as two different arms. One, trying to activate your own immune system, and the other is to just utilize immune molecules like CAR T cells. So the drugs that have been really successful in adults recently have been the checkpoint inhibitors, and that's a way that you're activating your own immune system that already pre-exists against a tumor that's seen as foreign, but just the immune system suppressed. So it's a way to unleash what's already there. We think that that'll be helpful in some children, like those with very high mutation rates in their tumors, so-called mismatch repair types of tumors. But the majority of pediatric cancers arise differently from adult cancers. They're probably abnormal development. They're epigenetic, meaning changes in gene expression, as opposed to acquisition of different mutations over many, many years. So they may not be seen as foreign or as foreign as adult cancers are. So some of those immune therapies may not work for children. We have to try, and we have to look at them and try to figure out which ones are most likely to work. But we need to have the regulatory burdens lifted. We need to have more funding, way more funding toward pediatric cancers, and specifically both in the preclinical stages as in the clinical stages, so we can figure all these things out.
I think, as a parent, it's tough to see that Emily had this success, and now it's the first time they got an FDA approval in pediatrics before adults. And there's parents all over the world right now, waiting for better, less toxic treatments for their children. And these doctors that all have great ideas and want to move it forward aren't being funded. So our goal is to continue in a positive manner, trying to bring them in more funding and allow them to, treat the kids. And and maybe we can have some more breakthroughs with children first before adults.
One strategy we've pursued at Kids versus Cancer is to create incentives and requirements for companies to undertake pediatric studies. So just last month, actually, Congress passed a law, which was signed by the president, that requires companies developing cancer drugs and biologics to also undertake pediatric studies. And so the hope is that if there are immunotherapies for adult cancers that would be appropriate and that, Dr. Tim Kripe wants to study in kids, that there's now increased leverage on his part to get access to these drugs and really determine whether they're valuable for kids. Mm-hmm. The second law that we drafted and were successful in advocating for passage of by the U.S. Congress is the Creating Hope Act Pediatric Priority Review Voucher Program. And what that program does, and that was in 2012, and what that program does is it gives a financial incentive for companies to develop drugs expressly for kids with cancer or other rare and life-threatening illnesses. And if they do so, they get vouchers that are now trading. It's a cap and trade kind of program, and these vouchers are trading for hundreds of millions of dollars. Wow. So the incentives
Nancy's done fantastic work. That really deserves a round of applause, because that makes a big difference. It's huge.
Okay. Well, I think we have time for some questions if you guys have questions. No questions? Really? Oh, wait, no. There are back there.
Good morning. My name is Françoise Bissay. I'm a doctoral student at George Mason University. So I do have a question on immunotherapy. Are there some cases, some cancer cases, where immunotherapy is ever the first-line treatment?
Well, I think that's the ultimate goal. We want to bring treatments up to first line that are non-toxic and effective. So ultimately, we'd love to get rid of bone marrow transplant. We'd love to get rid of chemotherapy. We'd love to get rid of radiation. We've made a lot of advances using those treatments. And so we can't abandon them right away. But if we could replace them over time with things that are more effective and less toxic, that would be fantastic. There are, in the past, when immunotherapies have been the front line, it's because there was nothing else. And at that point, immunotherapies didn't work very well. At the moment, I would say I can't think of any example where that's something we use as a first line or as an only treatment, but that would be the goal.
I'm not sure.
I'm Julie Byrne. I'm with the Boyne Research Institute in Ireland, and I'm part of a large collaborative in Europe looking at the long-term consequences of treatment for cancer during childhood. So we are doing largely retrospective studies looking at standard therapies, radiation and chemotherapy. But I'm just wondering, what are the plans, if any, in place to follow children who've been treated with these new agents? This is a question for Dr. Kripe as well as for Dr. Seibel, who's no longer with us, and with regard to the NCI's MATCH program too.
That's a great question. I think long-term side effects that are very important that we understand and we mitigate as best as we can, and so to learn what they are is the first step. The company that got the CAR-T approval is required by the FDA to monitor patients for 15 years based on some rules that are in place for any gene therapy that could potentially modify the patient's DNA. So that is something they'll be doing at least for that long a time, and they put into place as part of their FDA approval monitoring plan. I think it's going to behoove the regulatory agencies like that to make sure that companies that bring new therapies to bear look at that. What I've always said in developing our products and also with targeted therapy is, if we can monitor patients that long, great. We'll do all we can, because at this point, those patients aren't there 15 years later. So we'd be happy to do whatever it takes. I think one of the challenges when you get a grant to study something, that grant ends in 3 to 5 years. So to have funding in place 15, 20, 30 years later to make sure you monitor them is going to be up to other sources of funding to make sure that we're still doing that at that time.
Just to follow up on your question, Julie. So there is a study being done through the Children's Oncology Group looking at the late effects related to dinutuximab and neuroblastoma. And we hope we have the opportunity to study the late effects from those children who are being treated on pediatric match. But this is always a goal in any treatment to include the late effects.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Michael Carlin, and I'm with Ibex Biosciences. And my question is, for a startup company that we're producing certain molecules that look like they have both uses for adult cancers and pediatric cancers, and we're in the very early steps, what advice would you give to pursue the pediatric route as well as the adult route at the same time and not hold them back? So that's a challenge that we kind of have as we're looking at research literature. There's some good literature on pediatric cancer with some of the molecules are working as well as adult cancer. So at the very early stage, I was wondering if you have any suggestions or advice on that.
My suggestion scientifically is to make sure that you identify which kinds of cancers are, it may work in and get some good preclinical data to back that up. But secondly, to work with bona fide groups of pediatric oncologists to figure out how to best integrate that into the clinical side in terms of phase 1 studies and beyond. And that would be, with leaders in COG or disease-specific teams or experts in the field to make sure that you've got them on board so that when you do roll it out, it makes sense because usually we'll have to integrate these with existing treatments.
I'll also just add, of course, once you undertake the scientific analysis to determine that it's appropriate to study a pediatric cancer first. From a business perspective, it's very inexpensive compared to adult studies because accrual fees are like $5,000 per child, which is very low compared to adult studies. Traditionally, FDA has been looking at very small trials in pediatric cancer space and approving drugs on trials of trial size that are quite small, say 50, 60 kids. There have been several drugs. Kids don't have comorbidities like adults do. So in some ways, it's a lot easier to do kids. That's my pitch from a business perspective. And then there are these series of physicians like Dr. Tim Kripe who have put together consortiums where they take a lot of the responsibility for regulatory requirements and accrual requirements, data collection.
The other thing I might add is if you can impact a child, you can impact the entire lifetime. So.
Well, it's definitely an exciting field. Thank you so much, Nancy, Tom, and Timothy. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Now, please welcome Mary Billington, a cancer survivor. Back to lead the conversation is The Atlantic's Steve Clemens.
Greetings, Mary. Have a seat. Here we go. You have had 4 incidences of cancer, and I'm going to ask you in a moment to share with us a bit of your story and thoughts on survivorship. But I want to ask the audience's indulgence for a minute. Mary tweets at MMW Billington. She's got a fabulous array of tweets that have been curated here for me, and I just want to read some of them. September 12th, diagnosed at 6 months old. My bar was set at cancer. I'm really happy when I don't have cancer, but I'm totally shocked when totally shocked when I do.
Totally shocked.
Before that, TSA agent remembered me from last time she patted me down after I opted out of security scan. I know I'm out of cancer woods, or that I think I am, when I'm so focused on work I can't find time and day to make a doctor's appointment. Priorities, question mark. In my world, few things are more comforting than hearing a trusted doctor say, Mary, I will always be your doctor. I had a false sense of security about Obamacare and my health care. Just learned that Sloan Kettering is not in network for any ACA plan. Scary. And finally, beating cancer doesn't have to be defined in medical terms. I often think if I ever lose the desire to laugh, then cancer will have won. It's a wonderful array of humor, and I've had the opportunity to read some of your blogs. You're just human and happy for the most part, through some very trying times. Tell us what you've gone through.
Sure. So it's a little bit of a long story. So I'm going to try to give the Cliff Notes version today, and I apologize if some of it feels a little abrupt. I trust me, it caught me off guard too. So I am a 4-time cancer survivor. I was first diagnosed when I was 6 months old with tumors in the retinas of both of my eyes, and I received a month of daily radiation treatments for that. And then when I was 12 years old, I was diagnosed with a bone tumor in my right sinus, which was a late effect of the radiation I had had as a baby. So the radiation that successfully treated my first cancer diagnosis effectively caused my second cancer diagnosis. So at 12 years old, I had a year of chemo and surgery to remove that tumor. And that surgery also required the removal of my right eye. And so the eye patch has been a fashion accessory ever since. And then I was out of treatment for about 2 years when I was diagnosed with another bone tumor, this time in my heart. And so just after my 15th birthday, I had open heart surgery to remove that tumor, which was successful, followed by another year of chemo, essentially to prevent a similar metastasis from happening again, right? Making sure there were no rogue cells floating around my bloodstream that wanted to become tumors. And so luckily that was successful as well. And then I was cancer-free for almost 12 years, which I think was a perfectly timed 12 years. If you ask me, it allowed me to kind of pursue the other aspects of my life and to kind of think about what I wanted in life without cancer being at the forefront. And then about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. And that diagnosis is a little bit more of a mystery than the others. While unfortunate, the 3 previous times, kind of there was a story arc there. They made a certain amount of sense. And the breast cancer didn't really. But luckily, it was a very treatable diagnosis, and so I kind of went through the process of that again, did another year of chemo and surgery, finished treatment for that in December. So right now, it's been 9 months. I have no evidence of disease. I'm no longer in treatment, and I'm just excited to be here.
Well, we're very happy about that as well.
Thank you.
Mary, today we're talking about pediatric cancer, and the reason I think that we're having this encounter with you is to understand better what we don't about how to equip children to think about children's perspectives as they're going through this from a survivor perspective. You went through this as a child. I mean, your entire life from 6 months on has been struggling with this. What should we know about that some of us that are trying to understand don't understand?
Well, I don't know if this is something that people don't understand, but it's certainly something that's true, is that kids are tough, right? Kids are tougher than we are. I certainly know that now as an adult, and I complain about silly things. But so kids have this resilience in them that they don't even know, that their life is unusual, that IVs and blood draws and chemo and surgery and all that is necessarily out of the ordinary. So they just kind of step up to the task no matter what. I certainly feel that way about what I went through as a kid and as an adolescent, even when I understood things a little bit better. It's only now that when I kind of look back and think, geez, that was really weird. Like, that wasn't normal. And I'm still kind of coming grips to that and realize that, certain kind of experiences I've had are just not typical. But at the same time, I'm really grateful for all of that, which is, I think, a piece of this story that people don't always focus on. I think a lot of the time, we think of childhood cancer as a really tragic story, And it certainly can be, and there's a lot of work we need to do, and obviously I would like to prevent all cancer, but at the end of the day, my story and what I went through as a kid really prepared me in a way that I couldn't expect for what I went through as an adult, both with respect to cancer and in the rest of my life. When I was diagnosed with breast cancer, that wasn't the scariest thing I had ever heard of. That didn't flip my life upside down, right? That was just, oh, this year is going to be a little trickier than last.
You have another life that's not involved. I mean, as I understand it, you work at City Year, which is an education nonprofit. You do some volunteerism with cancer children. How have you navigated your professional aspirations and what you want to be and do with the fact that your cancer experience is also a huge part of you? You write about it beautifully.
Sure. Well, as I said kind of before, I think I had this. I was really fortunate there were two spans in my life where cancer wasn't really at the forefront of my existence. It was certainly part of it. There were doctor's appointments here and there. But it wasn't something that I worried about in a big way. And that was from 0 to 12, which was really critical in my development of kind of figuring out who I was and just being a typical kid. And then from 16 to 27, which gave me this wonderful window to go to college, go to graduate school, figure out the career that I wanted to have and start to pursue that. And so I'm really grateful for the periods in my life where cancer wasn't all-consuming. And I recognize that cancer and my experience with cancer and kind of being in these life and death situations from time to time really helped to define my focus and my kind of helped me figure out what I wanted out of life, right? And so while I think some people might expect that I would kind of take a back seat and say, I've done enough, that I really had the opposite experience. And I realized, we don't have much time, any of us, none of us know. And so I need to do the best with what I've got and do the things I want to do in the time that I have.
I know that you care a lot about survivorship and what that means and folks, and I'm sort of interested in the principles of survivorship. What are the, North Star elements, if you will, for people that you can, I'm always interested in people's experience and how you go from a completely unique set of situations to something you can convey to others as principles to think about with regards to surviving.
Sure. So I think one important idea to keep in mind, specifically about childhood cancer, as it relates to survivorship, is that the experience of having childhood cancer doesn't end when you reach adulthood, right? That is a part of my life that has affected who I am and who I will be in so many ways. In, not only kind of emotionally and psychologically in my perspective and my view on existential things, but also physically, medically, right? The challenges I faced as a kid will have implications for the rest of my life. And there are certain things that I'm at higher risk for a lot of different reasons, because I have a genetic mutation that caused my first kind of cancer. That makes me at higher risk for certain things. I'm at higher risk for things because of the particular diagnoses that I had at times in my life. And then I'm also at higher risk for things because of the treatment that I had. And so I think it's important to kind of keep that longer view in mind that, just because right now I sit in front of you and I don't have any evidence of disease, and I'm thankful for that, that doesn't mean the story's over and I won and we can just call it a day.
Let me just, finally, we have a lot of practitioners. I was intrigued with this question a moment ago about immunotherapy and potential results and after effects. And we have folks engaged in the science, people engaged in the policy, people who are practitioners, different parts of the ecosystem here. And I'm interested, as part of what I see and feel in a lot of these forums is this massive, leap in science and what might be possible in a few years. As someone who's gone through all of this, I'm just interested in how you look at that. Does it give you hope? Are you happy about it? Or is it something feels distant from you?
Absolutely. I'm thrilled about it. And I've seen a lot of that research and the benefits of it, over the course of my lifetime, right? When I was diagnosed as an infant in the late 80s, I received radiation because that was the only option at that time. And so it's what we needed to do to save my life right then. But since then, we've learned that there are, severe late effects of that, particularly with people with my genetic mutation. And so that's not something that's done anymore. And so I'm really happy to see kind of those developments, and also happy to be a part of them. As I often asked by my doctors if I'll participate in a research study or, give a little saliva to do so they can map things that I don't understand. And it's without hesitation, of course. I'm trying to advance this story as well. And some of that I will benefit from personally. They'll learn things about the treatment that I've had and what I might be at risk for in the future. But I also kind of think of what I can give to the people coming up behind me, right? We hope for a day when there won't be any pediatric cancer patients, but right now that's not the reality. And so anything I can do to help advance the field so that, people can make better decisions about treatment going forward for other patients, I'm thrilled to do.
Well, we're very grateful for you sharing your story today. Ladies and gentlemen, Mary Billington.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, a session produced by our underwriter, AFLAC. For that, please welcome Catherine Hernandez-Blades, Senior Vice President of Corporate Communications for AFLAC.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for being here. You've seen a lot about the research and treatment of cancer. I want to show you why AFLAC is so involved. I would like to take you and invite you to meet a family who's going through treatment currently, so that you get to see not just the science and not just the technology, but the human side of things. So to help me get that started, please welcome a very brave young lady, a personal shero of mine, 8-year-old Caroline. Hello, gorgeous. So, tell me what it was like when you were first diagnosed.
Well, when I was first diagnosed, I was in the hospital for a really long time, and I had to have a lot of yucky medicines. I had a lot of pokes and IVs, and it was just really hard.
Yeah. When you were in the hospital and away from your brothers, what did you miss the most?
I miss sleeping in my own beds, and I miss my brothers a lot.
Yeah. You want to tell everybody about your brothers?
My brothers are Blake and Ben. Blake is 11 years old, and Ben is 5 years old.
And I bet you are the best sister in the world.
Yes.
Yes, you are. What about, we had a great day yesterday. This young lady did 32 interviews on a satellite media tour. The adults were exhausted. She was raring to go. Absolutely so admirable. But why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
I'm 8 years old. I'm in 3rd grade, and I have 2 brothers, and I have a crazy dog named Tucker.
Why is your dog crazy?
He loves everything. Every morning he's barking at us. He wants us to get up. He loves us.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So if you had to tell another child who was going through your experiences something to encourage them, what would you say to them about your own personal experience?
Well, I would say it's hard, but we're all there for you, and you got this.
You got this. Well, yes, you do, and we actually have something for you. I'm going to ask Mr. John to come out now, because I cannot let you leave without giving you a Aflac Doc.
Thank you.
You want to ride on them or you want to walk off?
Now what? How about you give me a big hug and we ask Mr. John to take it all.
Much.
I love you. Thank you.
Once we have, we'll bring your mama, okay?
Yes. Another round of applause for Caroline. Now, please join me in welcoming another shero, truly one of the strongest women I have ever met, and that's Caroline's mother, Emily. Okay, now, Emily has agreed to be very upfront in terms of her experience. So here we go.
Ready.
Okay. You have heard the words that no parent should ever hear. Your child has cancer. Tell us about that.
It's a moment. It's a moment that in anybody's normal life would be challenging. But as a parent who's looking at a 3-year-old little girl, it's a moment that is forever before and after. Everything from that point forward was after cancer, and everything before it was sort of a blur. We didn't exist before that time anymore. It was all about what was coming next. How were we going to save her life? How were we going to learn all the information that we needed to learn? All of the medical terms, what the treatment protocol looked like, how to build relationships with the doctors and nurses that were going to become her new family. So from that point forward, your life changes forever. And even to this day, and she's stable, we are still after. We'll never go back.
And she was diagnosed at age 3. Tell us about her treatment and what that is like.
So Caroline was born very healthy. At the time she was diagnosed, it was a shock to us because we really didn't have a whole lot of indication that there was something this dramatically wrong with her. By the time she was diagnosed, her cancer had metastasized throughout her brain and spine. So they told us, your daughter has cancer and we need to start chemotherapy immediately. She had had a temporary shunt put in because she had a lot of extra fluid in her brain. So she had had a brain surgery already before diagnosis. They did brain surgery again to make her shunt permanent, and they gave us 10 days for her to recover from that brain surgery. And they said, okay, you're starting chemo. So she had 3 rounds of chemo, and then 3 more rounds of chemo with stem cell recovery. And at the end of that, she had not improved at all. Her first MRI had hundreds of tumors, small tumors throughout her brain and spine. She should have had radiation first because that was the most effective way to treat her. She was PNET, brain cancer. We couldn't do radiation because she was under the age of 4, and the treatment effects from radiation were too harsh for her body. So we started with chemotherapy, and at the end of those 6 rounds and a lot of side effects later, there was not a single change, not a single tumor had disappeared. So we had done a lot of work, and she had gone through a lot, but it hadn't actually changed anything. So we took a month and let her recover, and then we went into proton radiation. And we had 6 weeks of proton radiation. That was very effective. She now only has 1 tumor left in her spine and a covering on her spine that is tumor tissue. We think at this point that that tissue is dead tissue, but we go back every 12 weeks for MRIs to make sure that nothing's growing.
Yeah. What has the impact of this disease been on your family?
it's significant. A friend of mine recently said that cancer is a family disease, and I think that is the best way that anybody could really put it. It affects everybody. It affects her dad and I and her brothers. We immediately had to figure out how to take care of our boys while taking care of our daughter, who was in the hospital all the time. We had to figure out our jobs. We had to consider how to keep our lives normal while also trying to survive in an environment that is terrifying, and you're sleep deprived because those little chairs in the hospital don't cut it for sleeping overnight. So the impact on our family was, it was very widespread. We had to shift over time, and we had to create a new normal.
One of the things I admire about you so much is you've taken such a difficult situation and turned it into something so wonderful, and your generosity of spirit in giving back. Please tell these audience members about CureFest.
Thank you. I would love to. After Caroline was diagnosed, and I started to feel like I could get a little bit more on my feet, I started looking into childhood cancer foundations, what the childhood cancer community looked like, how to find others that had children with cancer, just to connect with them. And I was lucky enough to learn about CureFest. The first CureFest was in 2011. It was in the Northern Virginia suburbs. It was a small event. In 2013, after Caroline was a little bit better and I was able to travel, I came to CureFest and I was able to experience it. It's a gathering of childhood cancer foundations and the public here in DC on the National Mall. It's an opportunity for us to come together as a childhood cancer community to support each other and to be there for each other, but also to raise awareness. And so since 2013, it's grown over the years. We've moved from our original location way out in the suburbs, and now we're on the National Mall. There's over 80 exhibiting childhood cancer foundations. So if any of you can come to the mall on Sunday in particular, it's a sight. We have over 100 tents. We have a huge mobile stage. It is an all-day festival. There's a walk. There are childhood cancer families, children. A lot of survivors perform on the stage, and it is just, it's really a magical weekend. On Saturday night, we have a performance and evening program on Freedom Plaza, and then we have about 1,000 people who walk to the White House, and there's a candlelight vigil there. So it's amazing. I got involved as a volunteer, and it is now something that I do pretty much full time. It takes about a full year to plan it, so I feel very privileged to be involved with it.
And it's a fantastic event.
It's fun.
Absolutely amazing. What is the one message you would like to leave with the people who are listening right now?
I think the biggest message for families, from my perspective, is that from the moment that you start to realize that you have entered this new world, it changes you, it changes your whole family. Families deserve and need a lot of support, but I think just understanding that it never stops. Whether your child is stable or thriving, you still always have cancer in your life. As Caroline grows up, there are going to be things that I have to explain to her and help her understand. And so even if she lives to be 100, there will be lifelong effects for her and for all of us. So it's part of your life from the moment you get it.
Well, Caroline is remarkable, and you are such a beautiful mother, and it's so lovely to see your family together. Thank you. I know this was very difficult.
No, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, and thank all of you.
And now, for a conversation on big data and the quest for big results, please welcome Dr. Adam Resnick, the director of the Center for Data-Driven Discovery at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Brandy Davis Dusenberry, CEO of Seven Bridges, and Dr. Lillian Meacham, the Kathleen V. Amos Children's Chair for Cancer Survivorship at the Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. Back to lead the conversation is the Atlantic's Olga Kazan.
Okay, so as we've talked about already, there's often a lot of lasting effects that survivors of pediatric cancer have. So one thing that can be done about this is big data. A lot of different organizations and researchers are using big data now to follow some of the lasting effects, some of the determinants of cancer, and kind of track diagnostics and treatment that way. So we're going to hear from some of them today. So I guess first, Lillian, can you tell me a little bit about the day-to-day life of a pediatric cancer survivor? And I understand you have a personal story that you wanted to share too.
So I think that there's always the focus on cure. I mean, we have nothing if we don't have cure. But I think that what I hear from survivors is cure is not enough. And I think that the story from a patient really was a little bit shocking to me when I first read it. She shared this on a website, and she's okay with me sharing it with you all too. And she says that although her son is considered a survivor, the sad fact is that survival rate statistics that are widely shared with the public are so misleading. If a child survives 5 years and then passes away due to the chemical onslaught of drugs they were given to cure them, that child is still considered a survivor. Unfortunately, if the child survives but has permanent hearing loss, brain damage, loss of eyesight, disfigurement, liver disease, heart attack, etc., that is considered a win. Really, my mind and heart cannot accept that. We can do better. We must do better. So for survivors, although in pediatric cancer we have an 80% cure rate, 80% of survivors by age 45 will be living with a severe or disabling late effect. So I think that it's not just cure, it's cure with minimal toxicity, as Dr. Kripe talked about. I mean, we have to put that in the formula for protocols. So survivors come and they come to late effects programs like we have, and they have roadmaps, if you will, to how they need to be followed so that if they're going to develop, if they're at risk for a late effect, we know how to check for it, how to diagnose it early, and to get them treatment.
So tell us about the Cancer Survivor Link. How did it come about? What was sort of the rationale for it?
So Cancer Survivor Link is a web-based, patient-centric communication tool. So it's something that was developed at Emory, and each patient or their parent registers, and in this website, it empowers them to take charge of their future health. Their medical summary, they're able to upload, and we always say there are 3 things you can do on Survivor Link. You can learn from the virtual libraries, you can learn about late effects, you can learn about what you need to receive to help you have good health and quality of life. You can store all your critical health documents because, you know, in this day and age, there's a lot of access to your medical records, but if you move from one system to another, they have different medical record systems. So now it's a huge problem to try to access the important documents. So you can upload them yourself, and most importantly, you can share. So, and when people are moving around, when they're transitioning from pediatric care to adult care, they can acquire new providers and give them access to their healthcare documents.
And how is it, can you kind of clarify why it's better than or different than a regular electronic medical record?
So when you have an electronic medical record, there are different servers or systems that, whether it's, I don't know, Cerner or Epic or whatever, that if you go to another hospital system that doesn't use that record system, you go back to getting your records transferred and uploaded and so forth. And you might travel or be on vacation. So it's important to be able to always be able to get into your key health documents. If you have a health problem and need, while you're skiing, to go into the hospital, if you go in and you say, I'm short of breath, they're going to say, oh, it's probably asthma, it's probably pneumonia, you know, those are still big things. But
if you look at them and say, I'm a cancer survivor, you'll see the physician's face go blank, like, oh, I'm not sure what that adds to the equation. Maybe it's a relapse. Maybe it's, heart failure. Maybe it's something else. So now you have access to your documents, and you can print them and give them to them.
So that record would have everything, all the drugs you've ever taken, yes. Your whole history of your treatments, yes. Relapses, everything. Yes. Okay, so you could just hand it over to the primary care Minute Clinic person.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. And I think it's patient-centric. You're not dependent on a provider to do that for you.
Okay, so and kind of on the other kind of a component of that is the Cavatica program that you guys have built. Talk about how that got started. What was the need for that, and how did you go about putting it together?
Sure. So Seven Bridges since 2009 has been working to develop ecosystems that help researchers analyze and share biomedical data to ultimately improve health outcomes. And the reason that we drive this work has been that we consider that genomics and medical data is really putting those together gives us the power to predict. So it gives us the power to predict what the long-term outcomes are going to be for someone. It gives us the power to predict who is most at risk for developing a particular disorder. And what we know is that the way that we increase that power is by bringing lots of data together. And it's really only by initiatives like Cavatica that we're able to bring researchers with different sets of data, allow that data to talk to one another, and then importantly, get that into the hands of researchers to be able to use that to drive discovery.
So yours is more of a personal electronic medical record, and yours combines data from lots of different patients to see what are the things we can learn from all of these different patient stories.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting tension between the two of them, right? As was mentioned, each patient, there's a deluge of data that they encounter when they first get diagnosed, right? And then their whole records themselves, there's a huge amount of information that they essentially have authority over and in charge over. But at the same time, one of the biggest challenges we face in the pediatric space that's different than the adult community is that these drugs, like chemotherapy and radiation, do have long-term side effects. And these are children who are still developing, still growing, right? It's not as if any one of us would experience the same types of toxicities. And so there's a higher mandate for a precision medicine approach, for understanding the biology and targeting it. But the only way to do that in the context of a rare disease is to position that individual patients against a map of the world's largest data enterprise and figure out how does this patient compare to or is different than anybody else. And that's very challenging in a rare disease community. No single hospital has enough information themselves, right? CHOP is a phenomenal hospital with many, many patients, but we on our own could not essentially accomplish this. Similarly, we on our own don't have all the technologies and opportunities to really harness on behalf of patients. And so this is where partnerships between patients themselves and foundations, who are probably some of the staunchest advocates of empowering data on behalf of research, commercial enterprises like Seven Bridges, and scientists and researchers can come together on behalf of a community that is the most advocate you would ever find to drive an accelerated platform for discovery on behalf of patients.
So give us an example. So it's sort of almost like I'm a cancer survivor. What are my chances of infertility, for example? And then the doctor could cross-reference it against that? Or?
So one of it is prognostic, right? So there's an element of, in all fields of science, right, we essentially try to reduce the complexity and then put a patient in this bucket or in this bucket or in this bucket. But each of one of us is an individual who's very unique, even independent of disease. How do you interpret that uniqueness of a patient and the uniqueness of their tumor and make sense of it? And that's a very challenging space, right? We have 3 billion letters that comprise our genomic code. It's a highly complex environment that requires a tremendous amount of compute and analysis that allows us to interpret it. And once we can interpret it, we can have some prognostic and say, okay, you fall into this bin of patients that potentially respond to this type of drug. But at the same time, it provides opportunities for us to break barriers around silos. So particularly in pediatrics, this is a tremendous opportunity that now I think is being capitalized on. And that is that diseases in the pediatric space have a very different cause than in the adult space. Kids don't get cancer because they smoke or they're out in the sun, or they get it because it's a process of development often. And there are opportunities to intersect across diseases even. But there's so much information that I, as a neuroscientist, may not know about bone disease or cardiac failures in children, but biology is conservative. And the only way to connect is through data. And we have to do that much, much more rapidly than the human being can do it. And that's the way enterprises like Cubatica can support it. Cubatica essentially is a cloud-based architecture that centralizes and brings together data from researchers, patients themselves have uploaded data, the NIH, and almost any enterprise that can contribute into this context.
So I guess this is sort of a question for anyone, but a lot of what you're talking about, I mean, it's wonderful, but it almost seems to me like, you know, we've had iPhones for 10 years now. You know, we've had amazing computers for much longer than that. Why are some of these big data projects just coming out now? What have been some of the hurdles that you've had to get over in order to get to this point?
Right, everybody's looking at me. You know, there were some questions earlier on today, you know, around the political human space and how it intersects, right? And there's always this mix, right? Science is a human enterprise, right? And I completely agree. You ask any cancer advocate or patient or family, you know, in a time where, you know, the stock market does way more computing and analysis in a single millisecond than a scientist might do, right, across their lifetime. There's a disparity, right, or prioritization that we're only now are bringing to the purview of the healthcare space. Part of it, though, is a challenge to coordinate and centralize and connect. And that's something that, you know, the healthcare enterprise is only now sort of embracing. One way to think about it is that hospital systems are very much like grocery stores, right? You know, this is your hospital in your neighborhood, right? And hospitals are now reaching a limit to what they can do and provide and understand from that perspective. And the only way to empower that is through connectivity. Connectivity across patients, connectivity across researchers, and partnering with those who are leading innovation on behalf of technology. And so it's a unique moment in time that's really you know, coming to fruition, driven by foundations, parents, and those domain stakeholders who recognize that time is the most valuable thing you can essentially give a patient, right? All of these patients, Emily and others, it's a race against time. And time is something that data can actually impinge on.
Can I comment? Because I think, too, that when we look at pediatric cancer, when we look back in the 50s, of course, our initial focus was on cure, and it's always been on cure. But then as we moved into the 90s, we were getting these very high cure rates, and then we were starting to back up and say, well, wait, how do these patients look now that they're cured? And remember, when you cure a child of cancer, you've got decades of life to go. And I think the same thing perhaps is happening in the use of big data. In terms of, I can't answer these questions about the best designed protocol based on the patients that I follow because I don't have enough. So especially in pediatric cancer, through Children's Oncology Group, we all work together to utilize data from everywhere to make those decisions. And I also see now that we're starting to do that even more so and utilizing the big cloud of tetrabytes or whatever you guys talk about. I'm like learning so much today, but we can then take it and fine-tune treatment to the late effects, you know, the top late effects that are going to impact health and quality of life. Let's fine-tune the treatment based on what will work and then what will minimize the key late effects.
Got it. I think we have time for some questions from you guys. Questions? No questions yet? Okay. No hands. Okay. So I was wondering what else, so we have these great databases. What else do survivors need to help with some of these late effects? Like what else are you guys working on to kind of try to bring it to the next level or to really harness this data in order to improve treatment?
So I think one thing that, and I think this maybe is an important distinction, right, is that, you know, a database is one version of thinking about, right, centralizing all the information. But the other space, and this is where Cubatica and I think, you know, even some of the other platforms really participate in, it's not just the data, it also brings people together in an environment where they can compute, analyze, find other people who know something. Maybe a plant biologist has some information that I, as a brain tumor scientist, do not. And so I think, we always talk to patients, and the phenomenal part is that, parents like Emily, and Carolyn, they're walking storage data people, right? I mean, if you talk to mothers and fathers of patients, they know their whole patient's history, what happened to the minutia. That's never centralized or connected. And however, they connect to each other and cross and compare and analyze in ways that they just sort of do ad hoc. So empowering them, right, and their store of data, right, in ways that they contribute, but also, is compared to and analyzed in the context of the molecular. These are the new opportunities that I think really de-silo how we do research across diseases and across, different domains of expertise from our perspective.
Anything to, sorry, you look like you.
I like that idea of connecting people that you wouldn't necessarily think would be playing a role in this, plant biologist, anything. I mean, I just think that trying to bring tetrabytes together and people together, people who want to think together creatively, innovatively about, and then empowering survivors. The biggest thing I can do as a clinician is educate my patients and teach them how to advocate for their health, because I think that that's a key component, and it's lifelong. It's not, when I always get the question, when am I done with cancer? Unfortunately, you're not done. You're never done, because some of the late effects can occur right at the end of cancer treatment. Some begin 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years after the completion of treatment. So not only to educate patients, but also other healthcare providers, I think is really key.
When you say advocate for their health care, what do you mean by, in what way would a doctor not just listen to a cancer survivor? Or what are the circumstances in which they would have to advocate for themselves?
Oh, I wish they didn't. Unfortunately, I can't tell you the number of times that a survivor has maybe had chest pain or palpitations, a rapid heart rate, and they would go into their primary care physician, and the response would be, "Oh, honey, quit worrying. You finished your cancer treatment 10 years ago." That's not the right response. I mean, there's congestive heart failure, there's valve abnormalities, there are all kinds of abnormalities that happen in the heart after it's been exposed to chemotherapy or radiation.
And that, I think, is an important point, right? In the context, people think of cancer as organ-specific, right? You have a brain tumor, you had a brain tumor. But Severn Bridges, ourselves, and many others are recognizing that the real opportunity is not just connecting across pediatric cancers, or even across pediatric and adult cancers, it's across all of data. And some of these initiatives are also now being partnered in the context of, even at the NIH, we're part of a new initiative called Kids First, that for the first time will bring pediatric cancers and birth defects into a common space. And that's because historically we know there's some overlap between someone who has a cardiac birth defect and someone who might get a cancer, but nobody's ever put the two spaces together before.
Yeah.
So these new initiatives where data connects, right, and people connect, and those two layers of connectivity come across each other, are going to transform the way we think about healthcare, so that the advocate space, right, is data-driven, right? Patients are data-driven themselves. They go home the minute they're diagnosed, and they go on Facebook, and even if they've only had high school biology, they'll come in the next day and ask us for whole genome sequences at this depth, and right, and I want this analysis, and I want so-and-so there to analyze it. That's because the community is a store of knowledge, and that's what we want to empower in ways that I think will be transformative in how we think about it.
Totally.
So one thing I think also that we'll see over the next several years in the data-driven focus and long-term survivorship is new ways of early detection and less kind of emotionally stressful ways. I think imaging procedures can be very stressful and expensive. I think we'll see liquid biopsies coming online and making an easier way for us to be able to do rapid monitoring detection. And that's going to be, to get there, we're going to have to, again, bring together a wide variety of data both the genomic as well as the outcome data to make sure that we can bring those connections.
Yeah, and so hopefully we won't be seeing some of these late effects soon in the near future.
I'd love to be out of a job.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you so much, Lillian, Adam, and Brandy. I really appreciate you guys coming. Yeah, thank you.
So that is a wrap. Thank you to all our speakers and to Olga and Steve for leading the conversation this morning. I just want to wrap up a little bit. I'm sitting there in the front row and saw so much unfold on the stage this morning, ending with that conversation about the power of big data in patient care. Earlier in the morning, we heard Congressman Brian Higgins, who co-chairs the House Cancer Caucus, say, if America doesn't lead in cancer research, there is no leadership. A powerful reminder of the importance of the role that everybody in this room plays in this conversation. There was so much that we heard. Tom Whitehead's inspiring story of his daughter, Emily, and her T-cell therapy and being cancer-free for 5 years and now just starting the 7th grade this fall. Nancy Goodman, who lost her son to cancer 8 years ago after spending $2 million on his care, as a reminder of the urgency and the complexity of this issue. And it's hard not to point out the delightful Caroline Belcher talking about yucky medicine and missing her own bed, and then the recipient of an Aflac duck, which was a charming moment. So this is a medical conversation, it's a policy conversation, a funding conversation, but I think, as was clear here this morning, it is profoundly a human conversation. So I'd like to extend our gratitude to Aflac, our underwriter, for making this Atlantic Forum possible. Mostly, I'd like to thank everybody here in the audience. I know your time is the most precious thing you have, so thank you so much for sharing so much of it with us. Before you dash out, I do have one last request, which is that there are surveys on your chair, and you will get an email from me, or surveys in the room. Our team is around and can give them to you. We would love your feedback on this morning. It really helps guide how we produce these summits, and we want to make them most meaningful to all of you. So thank you again for your time. Thank you again to Aflac, and have a wonderful rest of your day.